Every week, more than 3 million Canadians know more about what they're watching by reading TV Guide magazine. Next week's issue on sale now.
Make way for the dimensional woman. She has the look of the 80s. She has dimensional color by Clairesse. No ammonia, Clairesse. Shade your hair the way nature does by coloring each strand individually. With Clairesse, you get gentle fragrance to match its gentle conditioners and beautiful, healthy-looking hair. Clairesse by Clairol.
Because I love the look.
I'm Bob Barker, host of The Price is Right, with a special invitation to British Columbians to come on down and join the fun right here on BCTV each weekday afternoon at 4. We choose our contestants at random from our studio audience and then ask them to guess the prices of a wide variety of products. The prizes are bigger and better, and the contestants are as unpredictable as ever. But we promise you a full hour of great fun and surprises, so join us.
The Price is Right, weekdays at 4.
Webster is next on BCTV.
Good morning. Just relax this morning. We're going to have a light-hearted, casual discussion with two people with vastly different views, one at a time, on a hilarious topic, the Canada Act, Canada's Constitution. Now, you believe me, it will not go away until it comes back or until it gets lost in the vaults of Westminster in London. But the first man you're going to hear is Ed Broadbent. Not a word, Ed. Just look.
I can't say a word.
Look expressive.
Smile.
You know, don't look like you look in the House of Commons.
All right, I'll just smile.
Look expressive.
Sit here, look contented.
Ed Broadbent, on the face of it, seems to be almost entirely in the camp of the man Trudeau, who's going to bring it back come hell or high water his way, like it or lump it. Mr. Broadbent will have a chance to speak in a little while. I also have here this morning a former defector from the Trudeau cabinet, where he was Minister of Defence, by the name of James Richardson, who runs an organization called Canadians for One Canada, and that One Canada has got to speak English only except in Quebec. At least his position is clear, I think we'll find. But first, to Happy Ed Broadbent, just delighted with what's happening in the House of Commons after the break.
He's called Belanger.
Ed Broadbent is the national leader of the NDP, and the jokes are over for the moment. When Trudeau presented the Canada Act in the House of Commons, you got up in your place, and I watched that noisy broadcast every night, and you said more or less, it's a civilized kind of proposition, and you gave me the feeling that you were already in the bag of the Liberals, and that with one or two minor amendments, you'll go all the way with the unilateral repatriation and all it means.
What I said very clearly is that even for a guy like Trudeau, who I've opposed ever since I've been in politics, from time to time does the right thing. And I don't want to sound either glib or hopelessly partisan in saying that. But if you look at the package, put Trudeau aside, because I think the major problem for a number of Canadians, whatever their political party, with the proposal is that it's coming from a guy named Trudeau. Forget it was Trudeau. Suppose it was Bob Stanfield or one of my predecessors and brought it in and said, what we're going to have is a Canadian Constitution. What we're going to have is the entrenchment of rights for all Canadians. What we're going to have is an equalization formula so that people in British Columbia or another wealthy province like mine in Ontario or Alberta have to some extent, share and minimum services our wealth with people in Atlantic Canada. So there's some equality in this country. We're going to have an amending formula at last that will enable us to make changes without requiring everyone to agree. Now, I say they're the essentials of the bill. Now, if anyone but Trudeau brought that in, I haven't the slightest doubt 90% of Canadians would be saying what I said, that that's a civilized package.
Maybe 90% of Canadians are saying that now, despite what you will concede is a personal animosity to Trudeau, not only in the West, but in many parts of the country.
In my constituency, and a good part of Atlantic Canada, and good parts of Toronto. It's not, you're absolutely right, it's not only in the West that there's antipathy towards the Prime Minister, there's antipathy in many parts of the country.
But they don't need your support to pass the bill. The Liberals don't need your support.
He's got a majority, but with the point I made to him, I made it in public, I made it in private. He had a meeting with Mr. Clark, he had a meeting with myself when he talked about the various things he might include, and I indicated there what I said subsequently in public before the nation, that if you're going to change the Constitution, any country that does it, the United States in its past, other European countries historically, no one party should be doing it. You should have a consensus, you should broaden the package. And what I said to make this an acceptable notion for the people of Canada is that you have to have something for Western Canada. You know, I come from the East. We jokingly this morning drove up in a car made in Oshawa, my hometown. And we kidded about that. But the serious point I made on television and in the House of Commons was that Ontario and Quebec, for very good reasons, like every other industrial country, you've had a region that's been protected by tariffs to build up industry. But now in the last 10 years, Western Canadians have seen in their resource wealth the potential to build equal wealth for them. And they're afraid of losing their resources. They're frightened because of certain Supreme Court decisions that the potential that they have, that I want to see exist, is going to be taken away. So I'm saying add resources to the package, then you make it a balanced deal.
If resources, the clearly spelled out ownership of resources by the provinces, plus the rights for indirect taxation by the provinces, is spelled out, would the NDP under your leadership go ahead with all other aspects of the Canada Act?
With the basic principles, yes. The basic principles are things that the New Democratic Party has said we believe in. But we want to push for amendments in committee. The Prime Minister has indicated that he's open to suggestions of changing the amendment formula, doing something about native rights. We're going to push for those things, but the fundamental question for us is to guarantee to Canadians, particularly in Western Canada, their right to control and develop their resources.
You'll go for the present package and half a pound of flesh, even if you don't get women's rights and native rights in an amended Canada Act.
We are going to be pushing on several fronts. We want to see the government's reaction when it gets to committee, but the matter that's front and center is resources.
Is your support in the House of Commons as a bloc, the NDP bloc, how many seats,
32.
32 seats. Do you consider that essential to give the package an appearance of some unanimity?
Absolutely. I think that one party doing something is wrong in changing the basic constitution of Canada. I've said that in private to the Prime Minister. I've said it in public. I'm saying it again now. You have an opportunity, I've said to the Prime Minister, of saying to Western Canadians who have felt alienated because of the small population, because of their emergent resource wealth, you have an opportunity to unite Canada by adding resources. Do it.
Question. After 2 years deadlock under the amending formula with the provinces, is it correct that any single government, with all the millions available for loaded questions or propaganda or media influence...
No, media types are bad.
Just a minute, they're deadly serious.
They're terrible tongue. Yeah.
Is it proper that a federal government, apparently without the approval of legislatures, can on 51% change the Constitution, amend it?
No, if that were just a criteria, but that's not in the bill. What is in the bill is the possibility, if there's a deadlock, that hasn't been clarified, and that has to be clarified. Right now, The proposal is the provinces over the next 2 years should try to come up with a new amending formula. If they don't, then we go to the Victoria formula, which really means we can have change in the Constitution if 2 of the provinces in Western Canada don't veto it, if Ontario doesn't veto it, if Quebec doesn't veto it,
if
and
2 of the
provinces
provinces in the Maritimes don't
okay,
veto
so the
it.
provincial governments then are involved. But then the next step would be a referendum.
Direct to the people.
Direct to the people.
Without the provincial legislatures.
Without the provincial legislatures, as they have in Australia, as they have in other federal states. But where I would correct you is that even with a direct referendum, there has to be a majority in each of the regions for it to pass.
51%.
Exactly. So it's not just, it could not be, for example, and we would never tolerate it. You couldn't load it. Ontario and Quebec couldn't have their say. The West would have a veto.
But I think I was right. Let me try it on you again, Ed Broadbent.
Excuse me, Jack, you said 51% nationally.
Let me try it again.
Yep.
If the provinces, if there's no amending formula created between the provinces and the federal government,
yes,
when it's brought back, at that stage, the federal government can go for a 51% referendum on any change, providing those 51% of the voters carry 2 of the western provinces, 2 of the maritime provinces, Quebec and Ontario. 51% in each of these regions.
In each of the regions.
That's the only thing I was missing then. 51% in each of the regions.
No, but that's the essence of federalism, because if you didn't have that in there, you could say that if it was just 51%, then the people of Ontario and Quebec could change the Constitution alone. But because it's a regional vote, it is saying that the people of Western Canada would have a veto. And I think that's crucial, just as it's essential to say that the change in Atlantic Canada, if it profoundly affects them, they ought to have a veto. So how can a Democrat object to that?
Well, for this reason, 51% may not be enough for a constitutional change.
It's got to have 50, it has to have that nationally as well as in every region.
Maybe it should be 66%.
Oh, then you're locking things in again too much.
Too much?
No, I think so.
Do you trust any... You're a socialist, by definition, democratic socialist.
I've got many other fine qualities as well.
Do you,
yes.
Do you trust a powerful government with millions in direct and indirect media propaganda money, to put it fairly?
Yeah, well, the final analysis is yes, in principle. We're not talking about a government of the day. We're writing a constitution for the future. And Australia has a referendum possibility. Switzerland has. Austria has the opportunity to go to the people.
Thank you. You're a political scientist.
Yeah, that's one of my liabilities.
Your answers are so long. After the break. Ed Broadbent, national leader of the NDP. You must be sorely embarrassed by the disagreements between yourself and the likes of that very forthright and civilized politician, Mr. Blakeney in Saskatchewan.
You know, Jackie, you normally get your facts right. Now,
let me give you a fact.
That civilized politician you described, Mr. Blakeney and I are in agreement on almost every question on the Constitution. He doesn't like unilateral action. None of the premiers do.
You do?
I do.
You think it's essential?
At this time, because we need a road-blocking mechanism.
You know now that the meeting of the first ministers with Trudeau and all the rest of that jazz was just a waste of time, and that we should have unilateral action
and
now.
That Mr. Blakeney, and I think Mr. Hatfield, one an NDPer, one a Conservative, tried to get the first ministers, instead of taking what I regard as, will almost certainly turn out to be futile legal action, tried to get them to build a better package. In other words, to go to Trudeau and say, look, we agree with these certain things, but let's improve it in this regard. I think that would have been a much smarter approach for the premiers to take and much healthier for the country.
Small point. I had the Attorney General of Saskatchewan on. What was his name again?
Roy Romano.
Roy Romano. And he stuck his feet down and said, nobody's going to interfere with our rights to control our ownership of land in our province. Now, that would be banned under this new Canada Act, wouldn't it?
That's right, that they would have the control. What would be banned? They would, under the proposal, the suggestion that was in Trudeau's original papers in the summer, broad economic powers, would have had an effect of stopping the provinces
But it's not
from
in the,
controlling
not in the
their land development.
Constitution.
It's not there now.
So they're not mad about that at all.
They're not mad about
Let's
that
go
at
through
all.
it one at a time. Surely you would prefer to see the Constitution coming back with the present amending formula, total unanimity, and then it being amended in Canada. Surely that would have been enough.
I don't think so. That's one option. I think we should do other things now. As part of the road blocking mechanism.
Does this not make Trudeau the kind of knee-bending colonial servant, sending a package to Britain which says, yes, 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 that's okay, you can have it, boys, with all your various provisions?
Look, I think that guy's been called everything in his life but knee-bending and colonial. Whatever Trudeau is, and he's a lot of things, he's not the kind of guy that goes around knee-bending.
You know,
he is recognizing the constitutional law here, as I do, as Mr. Stanfield does, as many politicians and many parties. No, you've got to go to Britain to get a constitutional change. How does that make you knee-bending? Maybe it means you respect the law.
No, it means that you're going to Britain to get Britain to make the amendments that you yourself, in fact, are not making in Canada.
Why? And why aren't you making them? Because we've had a silly structure. I don't blame the premiers. I don't blame the prime minister. I said after the referendum, and I hate the sort of 20/20 hindsight of politicians, but I said right after the referendum that it would probably be a mistake to have another First Ministers' Conference in September. They went ahead with it because it required unanimity of agreement, and if you have 10 heads of governments, 10 provinces plus the federal government, they all have their own power base, they aren't in a mood to give, you won't get good results. And we didn't get good results. So we need to break that route. We need another system, and that's why we need unilateral action now.
Jake Epp, the Tory spokesman, said on this program yesterday that the equalization provision, I'm paraphrasing, is a phony.
Yeah.
That it doesn't lay down a formula, that it can be used by the federal government for direct whatever it wants, and that the equalization provision in the Constitution is bad. Do you agree?
Should be improved, no question, but I always find it quaint to hear a Tory talk that way. They had a chance to do something about equalization when they were in government, and they didn't do anything about equalization. But we want the formula improved. There was a better one improved, in fact, by all the provinces but one at the First Ministers' Conference, and that's one amendment when the bill gets to committee that we'll be moving.
The Charter of Rights. Again, Blakeney, and you disagree on the Charter of Rights going into the Constitution.
Yes, and do you know why?
And many people, including myself, have a rooted fear of a U.S.-type, presidential-type constitution.
Oh, your pejorative language.
What does pejorative mean? What does pejorative mean?
Pejorative. Oh, Americans, American Constitution. Well, the Americans from time to time have something that's good. Now, for example, an entrenched Bill of Rights. You're in the media business. Mr. You're right, Alan Blakeney and I differ on an entrenched Bill of Rights.
Say disagree instead.
Disagree.
Right, thank you.
In private and public. And the problem is that Alan went off and studied at Oxford, you see, and they have this nice, quaint common law tradition. But being somewhat younger, true colonial position still, I went over and did my studying at the London School of Economics. We aren't as opposed to some American ideas. With an entrenched Bill of Rights, as I've said privately to Alan and in public, we could have what the Americans had, which was the Pentagon Papers, which you as a journalist should be of interest in. The common law tradition wouldn't enable, as happened in the United States, the New York Times to publish secret documents that showed the government of the day, and under their Constitution, the Entrenched Bill of Rights gave them the right to do that, and would give freedom of press, real freedom. The common law tradition wouldn't do it, but a Bill of Rights would.
Freedom of press for a monopoly press.
No, okay, you're shifting ground again.
Well, so
stick to the essence.
What does the Pentagon Papers got to do with the Canadian Constitution?
A lot to do with it. In this bill that's before us, there's freedom of the press. Now that would mean, in my judgment, if a good reporter, and there's some good reporters around, got some documents that were confidential, that the government didn't want released, under our present law, they could be prosecuted. They could be prosecuted, but they could, with the Bill of Rights, giving freedom of the press, take that right to the Supreme Court, and we may have a historic decision in Canada, and I don't mind citing the Americans when they do something good, equivalent to the Pentagon Papers decision in the United States that said, yes, the
You politicians-
people have a right to this information, even if the government of the day doesn't like it.
Really, you politicians, that is a red herring, Ed. We've still stuck with our
How is
libel
it-
and slander laws and precedent and all the rest of it.
Why is that a red herring?
Because I don't see freedom of the press really threatened under the common law, and I'm well aware that the American libel and slander laws are much softer than ours are. But you're getting me off the point. Politicians,
Yes.
at the moment, control our destiny.
Fine bunch of people.
A legislature or within its sphere, or a parliament within its sphere, may do with us as it wishes.
Yes.
Would you rather have judges doing that, interpreting the Constitution, than Parliament changing a bad law?
I think that there have to be limits on both. That's why I want a limited set of rights, so that provinces couldn't do too many things against fundamental rights of liberties or liberties of people. It was just a few years ago in the province of Quebec, for example, that we had a law that was aimed at Jehovah's Witnesses.
Padlock law.
Yeah, exactly, the padlock law. Well, under a Bill of Rights, you couldn't have that. A few years ago in Alberta, they had an equivalent law against the freedom of the press.
That was disallowed.
Eh? That was
disallowed.
ultimately disallowed. But if you had a Bill of Rights, out there making it clear in advance that there was freedom of the press, then a province wouldn't be likely to do
Next,
that.
you'll be quoting the unfair and despicable treatment of the Japanese during the last war, won't you?
No, not necessarily, because
That's one of the standard quotes. It couldn't have happened. It happened in the States with their Constitution. The Japanese were treated almost as badly.
It is an act.
The Constitution didn't stop slavery for 100 years.
Oh, but then the law was changed. I'm hesitating on the Japanese case because it's very complicated. It is true that whether you have a common law tradition or an entrenchment of rights in a period of crisis of profound proportions, the vast majority in any country might override both. But I would still argue that if you have an entrenched Bill of Rights protecting minorities and have people that are willing to go to bat for them, then they've got a greater chance of being protected than without that Bill of Rights.
We'll do one more short segment with you, and then we're going to go to the phones. Mr.
Wonderful.
Broadbent. Haven't talked about French-English rights yet. After the break. Would this entrenched Bill of Rights, Mr. Broadbent, automatically wipe out Trudeau's shame, as you people regard it, of the War Measures Act?
It wouldn't automatically wipe out the War Measures Act. It certainly would not. It would provide certain benefits about retroactively punishing people. And that's why we need additional changes in the criminal code to enable a government to deal with a real crisis, but not that War Measures Act, which takes away everyone's liberty. 2 points should be made. If there's a real crisis, and any democracy needs legislation for a crisis, we must not have in it the provision that you can punish people retroactively. And by that I mean is, if you're a member of some organization today in BC that's legal, we can't have a bill that's passed tomorrow that says it's illegal for you to be there today and then punish you.
But every democracy must have a good order in government, statutory, declaratory, arbitrary power.
Right. And the other provision in such a crisis, in my view, is that the Prime Minister of the day must be obligated to consult and explain, even if it's in secret, with the leaders of the opposition parties, his reason for acting. Because sometimes he will have to keep it secret. But to ensure that it won't be used for partisan purposes, in a parliamentary democracy, a Prime Minister, if he's going to invoke extreme measures, should have to consult the opposition.
As for extra legal acts by security forces in national emergency.
That's right.
Are you presently consulted on those things now?
Not at all.
Not a whisper?
No.
Is Trudeau ashamed of the War Measures Act?
My guess is yes. Because he spent all his early life before going into politics talking about civil liberties, and I think retrospectively, to himself, he thinks he's been wrong.
What do you say to these rather large numbers of people who cannot stomach, in this day and age, French and English entrenched?
I say to them, as a Canadian who is not obviously of French ancestry myself, that the provision that we're making in this bill is the minimal of decency, that has to be established to provide some equality of notion to our two principal cultural groups. All that it says is, where numbers warrant, French and English, where they're the minority in whatever province, ought to have the right to the education in their own language. Quebec has done it for years. For you and for me, if we lived in the province of Quebec,
if we lived there,
we would get education. And what it's saying is, where there is in my province of Ontario enough Canadians who are francophones, or if there's such a group here.
And you've surely dragged your feet in Ontario. Not you, but the government has, hasn't it?
Yes, indeed.
But we come back to the other point. Where numbers one, principle laid down in the Constitution by the federal government, I can see 10,000 picky little actions going to the courts who will decide what numbers warrant.
Yeah, I would think it would make more sense to have the provincial governments make that decision. I mean, make it a right where numbers warrant, but since the provincial governments have responsibility for education, give them the practical obligation of making that decision.
What final deal, I use the word advisedly, I'm not going to accuse you of going into a coalition with the Liberals yet.
I hope not.
That'll come down the road in due course.
No, it won't. We'll be fighting them
parties.
tooth and nail. Who's been fighting the Liberals on the lack of a budget? Who's been fighting them last week on polls? It's been the NDP, not the Tories. Just because the Liberals do something right on the Constitution, I want to be honest to say that. But we're fighting them tooth and nail on Canadian ownership of the economy and providing jobs and dealing with inflation.
As the country becomes more polarized, which this Constitution will help, polarization,
yes.
Surely, eventually, one day, after Trudeau goes, the NDP and the Libs must be the force of the left against the Tories.
You're always trying to put me up in one of those bizarre arguments. Why, if the Tories move to the left, they have just as much likelihood of doing it as the Liberals, and we had a nice two-party system, that would be fine. But I don't expect either of those parties, because they believe in their own philosophy, to move in our direction.
One question before the phones. Spell out for me in simple language that non-political scientists can understand what you'll vote for. What amendments you want to this? What changes?
We want
the minimum requirements of the 32 members of the NDP who would give a better appearance of unanimity for the Liberal plan.
What we want first and foremost is the right of provinces to control their own resources, to set their priorities of development and have the constitutional right to do that.
No, not in.
Not in this bill at all.
Next one.
We want improvements in the implementation of the language requirement. It should be basically the provinces that make that decision.
Equalization.
Equalization, we want to improve it so that it becomes effective and not just a declaration of principle.
Charter of Rights is okay as far as it goes?
As far as it goes.
And that's all?
Oh, no, we want some changes to if we can work out the appropriate language in the Constitution to recognize Aboriginal rights of our native people. That's very important. And also on the question of women, the issue of equality along the lines that has been established, if I can say so, in American constitutional law, that important question ought to be included too.
Wait for my generation to go, will you?
Ah, Jack, we can't wait for your generation. I mean, there are a lot of people in your generation that are very civilized about women's rights, who are not male chauvinists, and I even have hope for you.
When does closure apply, or when does the debate come to its end? Is there a date on it?
No, there's no date on it.
No?
No, there's a date on it at the end of the first week in September that the committee's supposed to report back. Right, but there's no date on the closing of the debate now in the House of Commons.
Jacob was trying to tell me yesterday that this committee is so badly set up that 6 Libs could sit alone in the thing. Are you worried about that?
That should be changed, and I think it will be. The Tories always look for some minuscule little detail instead of dealing with fundamentals. But
after this break, I'd like some direct questions. No good mornings. No, I'm an NDPer, or I'm a social credit, or I'm a Tory. On pertinent points, either questions or statements, clearly and succinctly. The first time Ed Broadbent has been live in my studio on television after the break. Ed Broadbent has been remarkably forthright this morning for a political party leader. Will you accept a small compliment? Just say yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
From Nelson, BC to Ed Broadbent. Go ahead, please.
Mr. Broadbent,
Yes, ma'am.
the Ninth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution states that the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Will we pursue a similar course? And I would like your comments on the Fifth Amendment, which is so often applied in the U.S., and will we enjoy rights that are not written down but that are taken for granted, such as ownership of property and pursuit of happiness? And will unnamed rights be taken away because they are not mentioned in the Constitution? I ask these questions because you mentioned limited rights.
Right. You've asked a lot there in sequence. If I miss any in reply, don't hesitate to pick me up.
I sure will.
Going from the bottom back, no. My clear understanding is that the rights that are not enumerated but are in our common law tradition would certainly be maintained. So because it's not listed there doesn't mean the right's going to be lost. That would still remain with the courts, and that's our common law tradition. The Fifth Amendment tradition in the United States that a citizen is not obligated to give testimony against himself is in fact in this bill. So that would be an additional provision.
That will be in our Bill of Rights.
Yes, indeed.
I see. So that any freedom of the press, when they give out this secret documents, etc., can be completely nullified by the Fifth Amendment when it does come to court.
How would it be nullified? It would protect protect, for example, in this case, a reporter from incriminating himself by giving evidence.
But witnesses also can plead the Fifth Amendment, as has happened.
Well, yes, if it incriminates himself, and that is.
Broadly speaking, however, I don't want to get involved in that.
All right.
Rights which we presently have under the common law would not be interfered with by specifics in this Constitution.
That's my general
Be
understanding.
written down anywhere.
Thank you, ma'am. Go ahead, please.
Do you actually believe that Christian is going to write anything on the province's resources? And when he doesn't, what can you do about it?
If they do not bring anything in on resources, the right for provinces, particularly to levy indirect taxes, it's very important here in British Columbia, would mean additional revenues for the people of this province, the right to participate in interprovincial trade, we will vote against the measure. That's a condition. Now, I think that the government wants to get support from other than Liberals. So if they have any sense in terms of trying to build up some unity in the country, they will take our proposals on resources very seriously.
Go ahead from Kelowna.
Hello there. I just wanted to say one thing. I think Ed Broadbent and Tommy Douglas are two NDPers that make a whole lot of sense.
Have you a point on the Constitution? We don't need any praise.
Okay. Anyway, I would like to see the Constitution patriated to Canada.
Thank you very much, sir. Go ahead, please.
Yes, since the judges, like the Senate, are permanent political appointees, can you not clearly see the obvious threat against our democratic system if we allow the Liberals to stack the judiciary with permanent judges who interpret and sympathize with the Liberals in the way they interpret and enforce the laws?
Well, that wouldn't change. Right now, the Liberals are the national government, so they appoint the judges. For a nine-month interregnum, we had the Conservatives. They were appointing judges. And as much as I'm opposed to both of those parties on many issues, on the whole, I am happy with the results of our judicial appointment, even if they tend to be active partisans before. Once they become judges, they become more or less independent, and they make decisions, whether they've been active before in previous political parties or not. The important thing is that they act within the framework of law.
Isn't it far better that the provinces appoint federal judges?
The provinces appoint. Why would I want the provinces?
He's saying with the provinces have the right to appoint their nominees, perhaps to the top court in the country, which would be the Supreme Court of Canada.
That's the better question, and that's something we've proposed, that the Supreme Court of Canada should have on it a number of nominees that do come from the provinces. I think that makes a lot of sense. That would produce a balance in the federal system.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Mr. Broadbent, you started to waver on the common law tradition when you said it remains.
Not waver.
You're not so sure that the common law tradition will remain.
in your second time around.
No.
The wiping out of the B&A Act, all your precedents will be lost, and common law tradition will not remain.
Excuse me, ma'am, if I may pick you up a bit. There is a common law tradition in states that have entrenched constitutions like the United States as well. That it's called judge-made law that operates within the framework of a Bill of Rights too.
Yes.
That you have a combined tradition, and that's really what we're calling for in Canada. Certain rights to be protected by the Constitution, certain other aspects of law would be maintained by the common law tradition.
Go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm calling from North Vancouver, and I'm wanting to ask, once everything's settled over on the Constitution, and they've, settled their indifferences and that, are the people of Canada going to be able to vote on it? And I think that's an important part, because it is us that have voted them in.
Good question.
As things now stand, that is one option open. For the next 2 years, if this bill passes, the government of Canada plus the provinces have an opportunity, or the provinces alone, to come up with a formula for a new amending procedure. And at least the amending procedure is one that would conceivably be taken to the people for a vote, but not the details of this particular bill.
I mean, the simple answer, it simply is that the House of Commons, and the House of Commons alone, will vote on this Canada
bill.
Act.
Oh, indeed. That is true.
Can the Senate veto it in any way?
Oh,
Not that it would, but
yes.
does it have power to consider the Canada Act?
Yes, it does.
Because it's packed with liberals anyway, isn't it?
Yes.
So it'll
should be
approve it.
abolished. I'd turn it into a gymnasium tomorrow and have compulsory calisthenics for all the senators.
You see, you're too flip this morning.
I'm not too flip. The Senate is the useless body in Canada. The decisive decision on this package will be made by the House of Commons.
And the Senate will follow suit.
Sure, because it's a useless body and will do whatever the government of the day says.
Thank you. Like to pick out any specifically useless senators? Don't.
No, I won't do that.
Because we haven't got our U.S.-type freedom of the press yet. Do you realize under the U.S. laws as amended by the Constitution that public officials such as yourself have very little protection in your private lives?
You're sounding like an American, Jack. You're saying the Americans can do some good things.
Do you
then.
realize that, not that I'm suggesting anything, but it puts a much sharper target without fear of consequences on the press of the American-type presidents?
Sure. Then we have to really be prepared to defend ourselves.
You're beginning to sell me. Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. Broadbent.
Yes, sir.
Rightfully state that the people should have a referenda opportunity to change the Constitution, but you must be careful as to how the rules for that referenda are set up. You mentioned Australia. I spent 14 years in the country, and one point of their referenda is that you say here we need a 51% vote. I hope that nobody ever bargains that away, because in Australia they require a 60% plus one vote to change anything of all the people, and then 5 of the states must agree.
Yeah, well, we have...
I didn't get his point. Is that bad or good?
That's bad, because you see, in Australia since 1901, they've had 77 referenda, of which only one group of questions pertaining to Aboriginal rights and the right of the Commonwealth to interfere in national health affairs have ever been passed.
Do you want 51%?
Yeah.
So do you.
See, that's why I think the Australian formula, though, accepts the principle of the people playing a direct role in amending the Constitution, which we accept and the Conservatives reject. I think the principle is good, but the formula in Australia is too rigid. And that's why I want 50% plus one in each of the regions in Canada.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. Broadbent. What is the problem with having a referendum on patriating the Constitution under the same formula that you described for earlier on the 51% for the 4 regions of the country? And number 2, what's happening with the Yukon and the Northwest Territories?
Well, the first question is, I mean, that might have been an option that could have been seriously looked at as a mechanism for breaking the deadlock, but with all respect, I would say that if that were the route that were opted for, a referendum to break the deadlock, the same provinces that have now taken the government, or trying to take the government's proposal to the court, would be even more furious. And so on balance, I am in favor, at this point in our history, right after the Quebec referendum particularly, of taking some action that will break the roadblock.
Thank you. One more segment with Ed Broadbent, and then we're going to have Jimmy Richardson. Remember Jimmy Richardson? Canadians for One Canada. You don't agree with Jimmy, do you?
It depends on what points he's making.
After the break. The budget comes down October 28th, said Webster to Ed Broadbent. Will he slap this infuriating, to Lougheed and Bennett especially, and Blakeney, tax on natural gas?
If he puts an export tax on natural gas, we will be opposing that. Everyone will be opposing that. It's not acceptable if he discriminates against that resource.
If he puts an export tax on all forms of energy, including hydro from Quebec and Newfoundland, will you accept that?
I think probably not. That's the thing that we're looking at right now.
Probably?
Probably not. But he certainly, if he brings in a discriminatory tax against export of natural gas, we will do everything to stop that.
But that's got nothing to do with your views on the Constitution.
No, absolutely not.
Go ahead, please.
I noticed that Mr. Broadbent is citing the referendum. I believe in the referendums, but I also believe that he's citing American law, and I think that if the Constitution comes back as is, that perhaps that we could have capital punishment in various provinces like they have in the United States. I mean, I know if it went through in British Columbia, we would buy the capital punishment here in British Columbia. I don't know about the rest of the provinces.
Can I respond to that? I am a Democrat who believes in representative democracy and believe that referendums should be used under special circumstances to deal with constitutional issues in the country, to break roadblocks. They should not be used on particular questions, whether it's on taxes or on capital punishment or on a whole variety of other things. To give you an obvious example, if you had a referendum on abolishing the income tax, I'm sure most Canadians, including members of my own family in Oshawa, would say that's a wonderful idea. Abolish the income tax, but it would be irresponsible. So I think referendum are appropriate in dealing at certain times with constitutional matters which provide the framework for making other laws, but it's up to us to make the laws. And if you don't like the laws that we're making, then you should boot us out of office.
And capital punishment is gone forever
For
anyway.
example, Mr. Broadbent.
Just a second, capital punishment is gone forever anyway.
No, it can be changed by Parliament at any time.
Go ahead, please.
You've got MPs that are running for Parliament, and they don't stipulate, they may run for a blanket platform, whether it be Liberal, Conservative, or NDP, and none of them have got the guts to get up and say, well, I'm for or I'm against capital punishment, I'm for or against immigration, when we have mass unemployment in this country. So, I mean, I think it's about time that you people, as MPs, got up and took a stand on these issues.
Well, with all respect, sir, I think that one of the reasons that we went up to the highest level of popular support that we have nationally ever in the last election, we did, and our candidates here in British Columbia stated very clearly where we stood on those questions.
Go ahead, please.
Mr. Broadbent, I respect what you say, and I believe that the strong federal government is very important. And about the resources, for one, I believe that there should be two prices, one for the people of Canada and one for export. And I don't see why all the resources that are exported shouldn't have a tax on it. And I'm not liberal.
Well, I think that the question you raise is an important one. If we're exporting energy resources, does it make sense to levy a tax on the export of those resources? Certainly, and we're having a look at that ourselves right now. If you put an export tax on energy resources going out, you can't discriminate against one part of the country. If you do it on gas, it's got to be done also on Ontario Hydro. But I think that there's probably a better method of raising revenue, and without saying for sure at this point, we'll probably support a position that would oppose an export tax on energy resources.
Go ahead, please.
How would the NDP reduce the national deficit, and why don't the Liberals initiate some of these proposals?
What's that got to do with a debate in the Constitution?
I don't know exactly. Is that what it's strictly limited to?
The way that the NDP would deal with that would be exactly the way Helmut Schmidt has done in Germany, which is to get a well-functioning manufacturing economy. That means right now providing some stimulus through tax cuts. It means an industrial strategy to develop the fishery and the logging industry. For example, here in British Columbia, there's been no reforestation program. We're going to be in serious problem in the years down the road if that doesn't start now. We need stimulation. We need a well-functioning manufacturing economy, but that would take a lot of time to elaborate on.
Yeah, it would, and I'm not going to argue about it because there are so many views on reforestation, what has been done, what has not been done, stuff that's been allowed to go to waste, timber being on the capital assets of American companies on forest management licenses. Maybe it might be better to go back to free enterprise.
No, Jack. We need effective management with both the private and public sector.
Many Canadians, even in the constitutional debate, are disabused by their elected representatives. They're cynical about government. They're cynical about feather bedding. They watch the civil servants getting a 24.2% increase of the common belief that they don't work very hard. And they think that this country is going to hell in a handbasket on occasions.
But it's not. I mean, that's the incredible thing, especially in the West. There's a sense of exuberance and growth. And if we could get this damn constitutional issue settled, for example, certainly Canadians of my generation are very optimistic about what we can do with this country. There's no reason for gloom and doom.
How old are you now, Ed?
I am 44.
Brought up in total affluence. Never suffered a day in your life.
Total affluence. My father worked in General Motors, and he was not on the management side.
Go ahead, please.
Mr. Broadbent?
Yes.
I believe it should be repatriated, but not at this point in history.
But when, sir? We've been waiting. Look at my...
Just excuse me.
All right, go ahead.
Very limited, Mr. Webster.
Do you want to wait till I die, too?
Mr. Webster said to be brief, so you must give me that opportunity.
Sure.
Now, the reason I say that it should not be repatriated at this point in history is that the Honorable Pierre Elliott Trudeau is far too strong, far too subtle, far too clever for men like you, Mr. Broadbent, and that includes the whole lot of you down there, to dissect. You see, as an example...
I have no fear of Mr. Trudeau, my friend.
Pardon me?
I said I have no fear of Mr. Trudeau.
You have no fear of him, but you're not capable of coping with him. Now,
in what respect?
Well, all right, here's the respect. This Constitution, if repatriated, it'll be loaded up, as you well know, with obscure language. There'll be an absence of clarity, and the clarity will probably be by design rather than oversight, and there isn't a man there.
Excuse me, sir. We have the bill right before us. I have it in my hand here, and a lot of the language is very clear indeed. Listing of rights that you will have. It's not
John Diefenbaker's Bill of Rights, which is not going to be enshrined per se. Now, I'll give you an example of what I'm trying to say to you. Mr. Webster is perceptive. He realizes. But I'll give you an example of what I'm trying to say to you by way of illustration.
Yes.
You know perfectly well that the wording in Parliament, the wording in the Omnibus Bill of the health clause is, which has resulted in abortion on request now. Mr. Webster and I have been over this many, many years ago. He told me never to phone in again, and I didn't. But the point is that the health clause, the use of the word health. Yeah. Now, what I'm saying to you again...
Good. You've made your point very well, and we've got a great crisis in British Columbia.
Very much.
With people taking over hospital boards who I regard as extremists.
Yes.
Who are subverting, it would seem to me, the unclear wish of Parliament.
Yes, I think that that's true. It is complicated because legally in the province they have the right to do it, but it's denying the effective right of women who may differ with them in their own philosophy.
Because the law passed by you, sir, with respect to the likes of you, is non-specific.
Well, we've got to clarify it then, don't we?
Maybe we should have women's rights and abortions in the Constitution.
That's a matter of law that we should be passing. You don't constitutionalize a detailed matter in that respect, or in capital punishment, as I said earlier. We should.
When do you expect to get your next telephone call from Mr. Trudeau or whoever
I would think
passes
about
on the word?
2 minutes after this program's over.
My thanks to Ed Broadbent, National Leader of the NDP. Next, James Richardson, former Minister of National Defence, who quit on the grounds of the entrenchment of French and English language rights from the Trudeau cabinet in 1976. Thank you, Mr. Broadbent.
It's been a pleasure.
Back after the break. One time not so long ago, my guest here, Mr. Richardson, seemed to be a figure of fairly heated controversy. But Mr. Richardson, with the best will in the world, your cause seems to have been lost sight of centered around your specific objections to English and French being entrenched in the Constitution?
Well, it's certainly back again now that we have the Constitution Act before us in written form. And I noticed the last caller that spoke just a few moments ago said that there would be wording in that Constitution Act which Trudeau would put there, which wouldn't be fully understood by most Canadians. And I would like to point that out right from the start.
Before you point that out in a moment, but I said, and I mean it myself, I don't see how any thinking Canadian, after the Quebec referendum, if he wants one nation to continue, can seriously object to the entrenchment of French and English where numbers warrant and in all institutions across the country.
But we're confusing things. Where numbers warrant applies to education. And I have no serious objection to that, other than agreeing with most that it would be better to be left under provincial jurisdiction than federal, because the federal government has never been in education, doesn't belong there. But that isn't the real point. The point is that, and this is what the Act says, that French and English are to have equality of status and equal rights and privileges as to their use in all institutions. There are the two operative words. All institutions.
Of Parliament.
And the Government of Canada.
Isn't that what the Official Languages Act has said since 1968?
That's more or less what it says. But the Official Languages Act, and this is my fundamental point, is an act of Parliament, which is amendable 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, as circumstances warrant. An act of Parliament can be amended by Parliament, but the Constitution can only be amended through a very rigid amending procedure, which includes vetoes for Quebec and for Ontario and others.
Are you suggesting there's something Machiavellian or conspiratorial in this, all institutions of the Parliament?
I am saying that
equality of status and equal rights and privileges.
I am saying, and I believe, that those two words mean that Canada will be a bilingual country under its Constitution, under its fundamental law, for all time. How can you have equality of status and for both languages in every main institution of the country, which includes starting from the office of the Governor General through the Commons, through the Senate, through the Bank of Canada, all the main departments of government, which include external affairs, and that's our embassies around the world, the Department of Transport that includes all our airports, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Canadian Armed Forces. I could go on.
But I thought that's what we had now under the Official Languages Act.
Well, we are trying to make that work, but it's unworkable. A nation can't work with two equal national languages.
I get the basic point.
I say that someday we will want to modify and adjust that. And my sole objection is that Trudeau doesn't have the right to lock in the concept of bilingualism, of two equal national languages, for all time.
You would not give the French language equality at all, would you?
I see the French language as an important regional language.
In Quebec?
Well, a regional language.
In other words, you agree with Levesque. English for outside of Quebec and French in Quebec.
No, I think that English will always be in Quebec. It's there now. I think Quebec is essentially a bilingual province, and Canada is a common language country. And it's a fundamental mistake to try and make Canada the bilingual nation, because it's impossible.
Are you saying to me, in effect, James Richardson, bilingual, and it's not your phrase, it's not my phrase, that bilingual today, French tomorrow?
No, I don't say that.
You don't subscribe to that conspiracy theory?
No, I don't.
I mean, you worked with Trudeau. You quit the cabinet over these grounds.
Yeah. No, it's the division. It's the equal national languages, which I think is divisive and unworkable in all the main institutions of the country. I don't think we can operate as a nation, but I don't think there's any attempt or conspiracy to be French, totally. I've never claimed.
Do you think that the English-French equality is unworkable in all the institutions of Parliament and of the Government of Canada? Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. I've lived there with it. I've watched it in Ottawa much more closely than others have been able to do that are not there. And I say that we cannot have two equal national languages at the heart and center of our nation and expect to achieve our destiny as a nation.
Will this lead to separatism in the West? Do you support Western separatism?
I would say that if what I am talking about would prevail, the West would continue as an important and main part of Canada. But that if this Constitution goes through, as it is worded, in time, I believe the West would start to re-examine its relationship to Canada.
Politicians tell me that all the time. Well, let me put it back to you again. You said politicians would start to re-examine its relationship to the rest of Canada. Do you mean by that if French and English are entrenched in the Constitution, that there will be separatist moves by politicians in the West?
I would believe that that would be inevitable in time because, well, that's what...
Who supports you in the way of politicians?
Well, everyone that you talk to, it's the public we're concerned about, not the politicians. And the public are increasingly concerned about the position of the West in Confederation. But I have always hoped that we would be able to avoid that. And that's why I'm fighting what Trudeau is trying to do.
Well, Trudeau, surely you will concede that Trudeau will do it.
I think he has a majority in the House, which he got for other reasons. You know, 18-cent gas and a few other things, nothing to do with the Constitution. He wasn't elected on this issue. That's one of the weaknesses of our system, that he can use the majority that he achieved for one reason to push something else through.
That's democracy, is it not?
Well, it is, but in this case, he's locking up the future. And I don't think he really has the right to use his majority for that purpose.
James Richardson, are you a one-man party? Because I haven't heard about your organization for many, many moons.
Well, we haven't been active in the days when the Conservative government were in power because there wasn't a clear picture there of what their objectives were. But now that Trudeau is back and is clear again about what he's trying to do, I find increasing number of people asking me to articulate the
Have you any names of high-level colleagues with backgrounds like yourself? I mean, do any of the members of the government of not Saskatchewan but Alberta support you?
Yes, there are members in our list. Our advisory board includes many people who are.
Do you think that the Western provinces, particularly well, Alberta, BC, or whatever, should hold their own referendum on this Constitution?
I think that on specific points, there should be approval by provinces and by the people. I think that this very point that I've just talked about, 16, Article 16, I don't believe that that would pass any referendum anywhere in Canada, probably not even in Quebec, and yet it's being really sneaked into the Constitution almost without comment.
Well, you could have fooled me. I thought it was the Official Languages Act entrenched.
Well, you're right.
But surely, as a modern-day Canadian, with the real threat of the Parti Québécois and the referendum, where we, genetically speaking, promised to be sympathetic to constitutional reform, how can you deny one of the founding nations equality and status in all the institute of the Parliament?
Well, I don't think we specifically made any promise or commitment of that kind. And what is more, I'm not convinced at all that that's what Quebecers are asking for.
Well, we know the Parti Québécois doesn't want that. The Parti Québécois wants to make it a French enclave with no French outside to strengthen their cultural position in Quebec.
Right, and they represent a very large
40%
vote. So that it's not at all unanimous that we're doing the right thing by Quebec.
Are you now out campaigning against this damnable Trudeau plot?
Well, what I'm doing is pointing out that he is writing into the Constitution in words that are unmistakable that Canada will be a bilingual nation. And if that's what Canadians want, then they should support what he's doing. But I don't think they want that.
What do you think will happen? We'll become another Belgium?
That would be, if this happens, that will of course be the case, because all our central institutions will have to have equality of status, equal rights for both languages.
You don't want that.
It's unworkable.
The majority right for the English, all institutions should be in English except in Quebec, is that correct?
I say that we have a common language, and it's been accepted by all Canadians, whatever their origin, outside Quebec. The principle upon which Canada is built is that the minority groups, large and small, speak their own language as much as they wish to each other, but they speak the common language. And they want to speak the common language. This is what makes this is what provides unity in the nation.
The English would eventually take over, and that would be the best solution for the country.
Well, this is what has taken. This is the answer.
Webster and James Richardson. Name of that organization again?
Canadians for One Canada.
Canadians for One Canada. After the break. James Richardson, former Trudeau cabinet minister. How long did you work with Pierre Trudeau?
Well, I was in Parliament for 11 years. I was in his cabinet for all the time in my first years, over 8 years.
Did you resign your seat? Were you defeated? I forget, forgive me.
No, I resigned from the cabinet. Then I left later the Liberal Party. I crossed the floor. Then I didn't run again. So I was elected 3 times, and I was never defeated.
Have you come out of the...
like Muhammad Ali, I retired undefeated. Yeah, I used to be able to say that.
Have you come out specifically on this particular speaking trip to warn people against Trudeau's Machiavellian schemes?
Yes, I would like the Canadian public to at least know what's in the Constitution Act, or the resolution that's going to lead to the Constitution Act.
All right, what's wrong with this man Trudeau's attitude? What makes him different from you?
Well, I think that the main thing is that he wants to see Canada tied up under a written constitution, whereas Canadians believe in the supremacy of Parliament and in the supremacy of their legislatures within provincial jurisdiction.
But mind you, I've said many times, and I'm sure you wouldn't disagree with me on occasions, that we've had 10 provincial potentates who really, for their own power, want to balkanize the country, and many times fight things in Ottawa which is not even, for which they're not answerable in their own legislatures.
Well, I agree that the division of powers is important. But it should be something that we negotiate. It shouldn't be something that gets locked in, a written word by Trudeau, and then, as you said earlier, only interpreted by judges. We don't want a government of judges in this country. And that's what we're going to have if we try to live under a constitution, instead of living under the democratically elected Parliament.
You've had this out with Trudeau, I suppose, on the entrenchment of rights, right?
We certainly talked about it at the time of my resignation, particularly, at great length.
Mm-hmm. And he just does not think you're totally wrong.
Well, he is trying to build a different kind of Canada.
What kind of Canada is he trying to build now? I want to get this quite clear.
He wants to build a bilingual Canada.
And you say that's impractical.
A Canada in which French and English are equal national languages. That's what he said many times. And he thinks that that's the way to achieve unity. I think exactly the opposite. I think that's the way to achieve disunity. I think that he has been building and creating disunity.
I mean, because of that the totally unilingual bilingual in all institutions will create bad feeling, bad relations, cause disruption.
Disunity, and also will build nationalism in Quebec instead of in Canada. Because I think that language is so close to nationality that you can't strengthen a second language without strengthening a second nation. And that's what he's been doing for 10 years.
How many, 6 million French-speaking Canadians?
Well,
15, 16,
they can't speak French. There's more than that are able to.
Go ahead to James Richardson, please. What do you make of him? Where are you? Gladys? Go ahead to James Richardson. Not yet? Where are you speaking from?
Kelowna.
Okay, go ahead to James Richardson.
We hope you keep going, Mr. Richardson. Where have you been for the last 2 years?
Well, as I said earlier, our group has not been active while the Conservative government were in power because they weren't pushing the Constitution in the same way that Mr. Trudeau has been doing. Now that he's back and has clearly stated his position, Canadians for One Canada are back again, and very much in opposition.
But I have the feeling that you and people who think as strongly as you do, were repudiated by the referendum in Quebec last year. That's my basic feeling. And we've got all the support for both cultures in Canada. Are the rest of us blind?
I don't think that was really what the vote in Quebec was about. Quebecers voted to stay in Canada. They didn't vote to have French language equal in Vancouver or in British Columbia. In all our central institutions.
I don't feel as threatened as you do. I'm an Anglo-Saxon Presbyterian WASP by definition and background. I don't see anything wrong. When I was at school in old Scotland in the dirty 30s, I took French, Latin, English, and German. I'm proud of my little patois and bits and pieces.
I have never had any objection none of us have to the use of another language or learning another language. I think obviously 2 languages is better than 1, like 2 university degrees better than 1. That's not the point. The point is that a nation, national bilingualism, imposed bilingualism, legislated bilingualism, that's what's divisive, and that's what's unworkable.
You're an Anglophone all the way.
That's what will ultimately divide this country.
Unless the Anglophones take over and stop this nonsense.
No, unless Canada develops as it has for the last 110 years.
Okay, I'll take a break. We'll clean up the calls, take some calls to Jimmy Richardson after this break. Jimmy Richardson, the rest of the Constitution the Constitution Act has to be unilaterally brought back doesn't bother you.
I've always believed in so-called patriation. I'd like to see the Constitution in Canada.
The only thing you object to is the entrenchment of the French language.
I think that we shouldn't use the moment of patriation to make fundamental changes in the Constitution.
Go ahead, please, to James Richardson.
Hello, Mr. Richardson.
Yes. Hello.
Very proud of what you're doing, and I hope you keep it up for a long, long time. You haven't told us yet, though, what an ordinary person can do to help you.
Well, I would say the best thing would be to try to articulate and explain what I've been saying to your Member of Parliament. It's your Member of Parliament who's going to have to vote on the resolution. And if you have a Member of Parliament, you should be talking to him.
Grand Fox, BC, go ahead, please.
Oh, Mr. Richardson, our hats off to you from the people in the Kootenays. It's about time that some politician got on the Webster program that spoke English and said things in down-to-earth terms, and boy, oh boy, does it ever make sense to us up here.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that.
Sick and tired of Mr. Trudeau. He was dark pink a long time ago, and he's getting redder every day.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. Richardson. It's very nice to see you on the thing, being a former Winnipegger, but I'm in the Canadian Armed Forces, and I've been across the country from coast to coast, and I don't really feel that there's many people in the forces that are really interested in learning French. I, for one, am that type of person. I've been in New Brunswick where there's a heavy populated French area. I've also been, in Winnipeg in the St. Boniface area, which, as you know, is very heavily populated in French. But I, for one, have no interest in learning French. Because in the armed forces, what good is it going to be doing me, when I'm firing a rifle, say if we have to go to war or anything?
Well, you're the person and many, many others that I'm speaking about and thinking of, because the Canadian Armed Forces are, just in these words, they are an institution of the government of Canada.
Isn't the target now to make it bilingual?
Well, of course. There is have equality of status and equal rights.
Do you have any unilingual French units that you work with, soldier?
Pardon me?
Have you worked with any unilingual French units or bilingual units?
Yeah, when I've been around Alcarche, Quebec, etc.
Do you have any French-Canadian officers in your outfit?
Yes, there's 2 of them.
And they speak French or English to you?
Speak both French and English. But they'll pay for us if we want to learn French. But 99% of us don't want to. We're quite happy when we're working on trucks and different things, or working on firing on a range. French is not going to help us.
Yeah, the Canadian Armed Forces used to be one of our great sources of unity in the country until we got on the bilingual kick. Well, unity, that's a good kind of unity to have. Yeah.
Best of luck, soldier. Au revoir. Au revoir, mon vieux. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I certainly, this line?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, well, I certainly agree with every word Mr. Richardson says. And anyone who has read the book, Federalism and the French Canadians, know what Trudeau is up to. His plan is to plant French families at certain places like post offices and stations and so on, so that people will be forced to build schools and speak French.
Here's a nice little old lady who says that there's a secret conspiracy to migrate French Canadians into key positions to force bilingual education. Do you subscribe to that?
I certainly do.
No,
I think there's some evidence that is what is happening.
Who's doing it?
Well, the federal government has to have people operating there. She mentioned post offices, but there are many other institutions of the federal government in the provinces. They are going to be manned by personnel who will be French-speaking.
This will be a deliberate choice?
Well, it'll be the way it will work under this type of legislation, and it'll work increasingly that way. There will be increasing an attempt to strengthen the use of the French language in
a master plan to force bilingualism in all institutions by the transfer of French Canadians?
Not so much a master plan as a concept of seeing Canada as a bilingual nation, which is the Trudeau concept.
Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Mr. Webster, Mr. Richardson. I really don't see why you put on such an act about French and English. I'm just wondering if your name had have been Mr. Richard instead of Mr. Richardson, what you would have done. I'm from the East. I love British Columbia, but I love speaking both languages.
Well, I think it's great to speak both languages, and I have never quarreled with that. I'm talking about it being a requirement, a national requirement to work in one of the main federal institutions, to be in the armed forces. I think that is what is divisive about the...
Could you know, in your intransigent position, in a country which gave French Canadians under the BNA Act certain inalienable rights, could you not be regarded as really quite a fanatical extremist?
I would say that I would agree totally with the rights in the BNA Act for French speaking. I know exactly what they are.
Limited rights.
They're in Section 133. And if those were the rights we were talking about, I certainly wouldn't be anybody who's objecting. It's the whole change that I'm concerned, the addition of rights.
Is Canada workable as an officially bilingual nation?
No.
Go ahead, please.
Mr. Richards.
Yes.
You only got a short comment, ma'am.
Hello?
Hello.
Yes.
Mr. Richards.
Yes, good morning.
I'm delighted to see you going across the country. I'm with you all the way. Now my question. I would like to know what's going to happen to the monarchy.
Ma'am, here's your answer.
As far as this Constitution is concerned, there's no change in the monarchy. It's exactly as the Queen is the Queen of Canada.
My thanks to James Richardson, former Trudeau cabinet minister, who is now Canadians for One Canada. After the break. Friday, Monday.
Monday, we definitely have Sir John Ford.
And a few other things.
And a few
I've got to give a plug to the Best of Webster, which is on every Sunday afternoon at 5:30 p.m. precisely. This week, Louis Laberge. Best of Webster's on every Sunday. Quite good. Monday, 9 a.m. precisely.
Stand by, Jack, for the ID.